Hey there, Beatle fans. How are you today? This is Terry and I'm Glenn, and this show is
The Beatles Talk Show, where we're going to look at daily events. Today we're looking at January 8th. All through the years, any Beatle historical facts that happen that we find intriguing that we want to talk about.
Yeah.
And the first one that I find actually the most important, which is probably why we even got the Beatles in the first place, is it's Elvis Presley's birthday.
Hey.
He was born on January 8th in 1935. He became a major worldwide star in 1956. That's when John and Paul would have first heard him. Elvis was only 21 and John was 15, so there wasn't even a huge age difference at the time. But rock and roll was this new thing. It got John very excited. He wanted to become a musician. Of course, that leads to the Quarrymen and the Beatles, and we know that whole story. So we can't go into all the detail.
No, well, a lot of people know the history. Elvis fans know the history of Elvis, but a lot of Beatle fans don't know the history of Elvis. And like Terry said, one of the reasons the Beatles got into music in the first place, and John Lennon said, is because of Elvis Presley. John Lennon said, before Elvis Presley there was nothing. So that tells you how big of an influence Elvis was on them. As much as, and Buddy Holly as well was a big influence. I'm not sure what Buddy Holly was doing on this day, but back then, Little Richard was a huge influence on Paul McCartney, but definitely Elvis was the man, I think. You're right, to propel them. And also, did you know that Elvis's biggest hit of all time, Don't Be Cruel, was released on this day?
It hit number one.
11 weeks, I believe.
On this date? Yeah, 11 weeks at number one.
I think so.
Massive song. He signed with RCA Records and changed the world of music forever. And again, became a sensation over in England as well. He was so huge. What's interesting is, yes, he became John Lennon's biggest influence and inspiration to become a musician and a rock star, and then wanted to become famous. And it was also on this date, ironically, in 1957. Elvis had only been a huge star for 1 year, and he had to do an exam to go into the army, and they picked him. And John Lennon later commented about that.
He said that was the day that Elvis died, was that day when he entered the army, because John liked the rock and roll Elvis. Because when he came out, how long was Elvis in the army for? Was it how many?
Couple years.
Couple years. When he came out,
58 to 60.
Yeah, when he came out, he wasn't the same Elvis as when he went in. Things had changed. He became kind of the Hollywood Elvis, if I remember correctly from what I've seen. And his first appearance was on the Frank Sinatra show, doing what's that pretty song? Still one of my favorite Elvis songs. Oh goodness, I can't remember. But anyway, it's definitely a different Elvis than what they were used to, what John and Paul grew up with early on, for sure. So that's a good point to be made right there.
Later on this date, January 8th in 1963, the Beatles were finally hitting the big time, and they even had their first number one single, Please Please Me, in England, and they were out promoting it big time. And they were even going out and they were lip syncing the song for promotion, which that's what many acts do on TV, etc. So that's interesting, and that's very early on in the stage. The Beatlemania hasn't really hit yet. This is early. They're just out to promote this brand new single, which would later be the start of Beatlemania in England.
That's right. That's true, And also in 1966, We Can Work It Out becomes the number one single in the U.S. Another great song, sung by Paul.
And that was another one of their Christmas singles. And continued into number one into January of 1966, coming from the British album Rubber Soul.
Great album.
But We Can Work It Out did not appear on the American Rubber Soul.
Okay.
So you had to buy the 45 if you lived in the U.S. and Canada. But if you were over in England and possibly through Europe, you would have got the song on the album. And of course, when they released all the albums on CD, finally in the 80s, they only decided to release the British versions. So for all us North American kids who grew up with Beatle albums, these albums were different. And now all these years later. I'm totally confused trying to remember which version is
Well,
which.
they just come out recently too, maybe in the last year or so, with the American mono record collection, which we actually owned back in the 70s. Because like you, I owned only the American albums. So when I got the Beatles Help album, I only had 5 or 6 songs, and the rest were instrumentals from the movie. I'm like, what's going on here? You know, until years later, like you said, the CD comes out 20 years later, and then you actually get this whole array of songs.
Yeah.
So what did they do? They actually put songs per se from like Help. What did they do? They would split it up. Help, Beatles 65. What did they do? How
It
many
would be
albums were
different
covered?
albums. It could be as much as 4 different albums, but it would also be singles, B-sides,
Okay.
and maybe even the odd unreleased song.
Well,
Bad Boy comes to mind. It's one of
Yeah.
these songs that just didn't fit on any
yeah,
album.
yeah, it's a
And
good
so
song.
it ends up
Yeah.
appearing somewhere eventually.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like A Hard Day's Night too. I bought the album Something New and A Hard Day's Night, and I thought they were 2 separate albums, but actually they're the same album.
That's right.
Because they're the British release of A Hard Day's Night
Yeah.
is Something New and A Hard Day's Night. And God knows how many other ones, right?
But of course, Capitol Records at the time was technically doing the right thing. Business-wise,
business-wise.
they made a lot more money, right? They sold
Absolutely.
twice as many records. The Beatles were releasing 4 albums a year in America
Yeah.
and only 2 in England.
That's
So, plus the demographics, how many more copies were sold in
Yeah.
America due to
Yeah.
the population. I mean, the Beatles were getting rich off the American market, whether they say they
Yeah.
like those albums or not. So, of
Ye-
course, starting with Sgt. Pepper, they did put an end to that and
Yeah.
said, okay, no
Yeah.
more separation.
Yeah.
Our albums need to
Yeah.
be the same everywhere, and that continued
Yeah.
through the late 60s.
Speaking of Sgt. Pepper, I just thought of something. They left off Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. And George Martin said years later he thought that was the biggest mistake he ever made, that he should have put those on the album instead of having them only as singles. I kind of agree with that. But anyway, I'm trying to get back on topic.
It is a different market at the time because
Yeah.
artists were expected to release a single every 3
Every
months.
3 months.
If you didn't have an album ready, you need to at least release a single.
Yeah.
That's not done anymore in
No.
the business, but
No.
back then it was.
Yeah.
So it made sense. The Beatles need a single. They got to release 2 songs.
Yeah.
Eventually the album comes out. Could they have put the songs on the album? Yes, they could have. But I guess at that point they probably went, why? It's already old news because the public expects a new record every 3 months.
That's
So
true.
why put the songs from
I know.
3 months ago on the new record? What's the point?
But you know what? Compared to today's music, I mean, artists today, you're lucky if you get 1 album a year. You're very lucky. So to release 3 or 4 albums in a year, or whatever the case may be,
Right.
was really something.
It just shows the business has changed. It's bigger
Yeah.
business. There's way more money. There's touring. There's TV
Yeah.
promotion.
Yeah.
I mean, acts really do more now than they did because they have the time to do it. How many acts go on tour and their tour lasts 15 months or something?
Yeah.
I mean, in 15 months, the Beatles have already released 5 albums.
I know.
It's just, it moves on. And then actually, an interesting story, Elton John, in 1973, his album Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, had more hits than was common at the time. Most albums were lucky to have 2 hits. But he was going on his 4th hit, but Elton John did like to release a new album like every 9 months.
Yeah.
So by the time he's ready to release Candle in the Wind as the next single, they're like, well, why would you do that? You've already got your new album ready to go. So they're like, okay, we won't release it
Yeah.
because I got a new album to promote with new singles.
Excuse me. That's like Paul McCartney's Band on the Run from 1973. Look at all the great songs that came off that. Jet, Band on the Run. I mean, there's a lot of good tunes on it.
Yeah.
That was a great period in music as well. That early 70s stuff. Very good. But anyway, that's enough for today's. We've run out of time. Sorry if we started rambling on about other things, but that's our Beatle news for today on this date, and we will see you tomorrow. So until then, again, take care, peace. We love you guys. So my dear friends, come back when you can.